he went to sleep heir to a multi-million-dollar empire and woke up with nothing but the clothes on his back and his dead father's moth-eaten coat. But when Leonard felt a strange crinkle in the lining, he discovered the old man hadn't left him penniless. He had left him a puzzle. The rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harrison and Sterling law offices in Mayfair seemed perfectly orchestrated to match the bleakness of the afternoon. Leonard Paul sat rigidly in a high-backed leather chair, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Across the mahogany conference table sat his stepmother, Beatrice, radiating a quiet, venomous triumph. Beside her was Richard, Leonard's younger half-brother, busy checking his Rolex and looking profoundly bored by the very concept of mortality. At the head of the table, Mr. Abernathy, a senior partner whose billable hours could rival the GDP of a small island nation, adjusted his spectacles. He cleared his throat, the sound dry as parchment. "We now come to the final disbursements of the estate of the late Thomas Paul," Abernathy droned, his eyes flicking nervously toward Leonard, before returning to the heavy, wax-sealed document. Leonard held his breath. He had spent the last 12 years running the ground operations of Paul Shipping, a logistics titan that moved cargo from London to Singapore. He had missed birthdays, sacrificed relationships, and lived out of a suitcase in humid ports just to prove himself to a father who rarely offered a word of praise. Thomas Paul was a hard, cold man, a self-made titan who believed affection made a man weak. But Leonard had always believed that in the end, the old man would recognize loyalty. He was devastatingly wrong. "To my wife Beatrice," Abernathy read, his voice painfully clear in the silent room, "I leave the estate in Surrey, the primary liquid assets held at Coutts & Co., and the controlling shares of Paul Shipping. To my youngest son Richard, I leave the title to the London properties, the vintage automotive collection, and my seat on the executive board." Leonard felt the blood drain from his face. That was it. That was the entirety of the empire. The company he had bled for was gone, handed over to a woman who despised him and a 24-year-old socialite who couldn't tell a cargo manifest from a cocktail menu. "And to my eldest son, Leonard," Abernathy continued, the lawyer's voice dropping half an octave in what sounded like genuine pity. Beatrice leaned forward, her red lips curving into a smirk. Richard finally looked up from his watch. "To Leonard, who always insisted that a man's worth is measured by his resilience and not his bank account, I leave my 1994 Barber Boofoot jacket. May it keep him warm when the world goes cold. Furthermore, I hereby decree that Leonard is to vacate his company-provided residence within 24 hours. He is formally severed from Paul Shipping, effective immediately." The silence that followed was suffocating. "A jacket," Leonard whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "He left me a jacket?" "It appears so, Leonard," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Thomas always said you needed to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. Consider this his final lesson." Leonard didn't argue. He didn't scream. The sheer scale of the betrayal had temporarily severed his connection to reality. He stood up, numb, accepted the folded, worn, waxed cotton jacket from the lawyer's trembling hands, and walked out of the office into the biting London rain. By nightfall, Leonard was sitting in a dingy pub in Camden, a pint of warm ale untouched in front of him. His phone had already been disconnected company policy. His keycard to the high-rise apartment had been deactivated. He was 34 years old, technically homeless, and entirely penniless, staring at a beat-up, olive-green jacket smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and wet dog. Anger, hot and blinding, finally pierced through his shock. He grabbed the jacket, intending to hurl it into the pub's crackling fireplace. But as his fingers gripped the heavy fabric of the collar, he felt something rigid. Leonard stopped. He ran his thumb over the tartan inner lining. The Barber jacket was old, its waxed exterior cracked and repatched in several places, but along the lower seam of the inside game pocket, the stitching looked wrong. It was newer, thicker thread, hastily sewn. His heart performed a strange arrhythmic flutter. Thomas Paul was a meticulous man. He would never tolerate a shoddy repair on his favorite coat unless he had done it himself in a hurry. Borrowing a steak knife from the bartender, Leonard took the jacket into a dimly lit corner booth. Carefully, he sliced through the thick nylon thread. The fabric parted and he reached into the hidden cavity. His fingers brushed against cold plastic. Leonard pulled out a vacuum-sealed waterproof bag. Inside was a heavy brass safety deposit box key, a heavily redacted deposit slip from Banque Privée Edmond de Rothschild in Geneva, and a meticulously hand-drawn topographical map on heavy parchment paper. He laid the items on the sticky pub table. The deposit slip had no account number, only a series of 9 alphanumeric digits and a date a week before his father's fatal heart attack. But it was the map that commanded his attention. It wasn't a map of a tropical island or a pirate's cove. It was a highly detailed rendering of a jagged coastline, complete with depth soundings and elevation lines. In the bottom right corner, written in his father's unmistakable, sharp handwriting, were coordinates and a single phrase: "The truth isn't in the ledger, Leonard. It's in the bedrock." A. P. Leonard stared at the initials. Amelia Paul, his mother. She had died in a tragic boating accident when Leonard was just 6 years old. The official story was that she was caught in a sudden storm off the coast of Cornwall. His father had never spoken of her again, banishing her memory from the Surrey estate entirely. Leonard pulled out his dead company phone, realizing it was useless, and instead asked the bartender to borrow his iPad. He punched the coordinates from the map into Google Earth. The satellite image zoomed in, spinning the globe, diving down into the United Kingdom, sweeping past London, heading southwest, until it locked on to a remote, treacherous stretch of the Cornish coastline, a few miles off Polbro, right where his mother had died. Leonard looked back at the moth-eaten jacket. He had been disowned, cast aside, but his father hadn't left him out in the cold. He had left him a trail of breadcrumbs leading to a 28-year-old ghost. The journey to Cornwall was an exercise in exhaustion. Having pawned his gold cufflinks, the only item of value he had been wearing at the reading of the will, Leonard bought a one-way train ticket to Plymouth and rented a heavily dented Vauxhall hatchback. By the time he reached the coastline, a dense, salty fog had rolled in off the Celtic Sea, swallowing the winding, narrow roads. The coordinates pointed to a jagged peninsula known locally as Dead Man's Point, a treacherous outcrop of black rock, notorious for shredding the hulls of careless fishing vessels. Leonard parked the Vauxhall on a gravel turnout and continued on foot, pulling the worn Barber jacket tight against the biting wind. The terrain was brutal. Slick grass gave way to razor-sharp shale. He checked the hand-drawn map against the landscape. His father had marked a specific indentation in the cliff face, accessible only at low tide. As Leonard scrambled down the steep embankment, the roar of the crashing waves deafened him. He timed his descent carefully, waiting for the ocean to recede before rushing across a stretch of slippery algae-covered rocks. He ducked into a natural fissure in the cliffside, stepping out of the wind. It wasn't a cave. It was a man-made tunnel, camouflaged by the natural overhang of the rock. Leonard clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight. The beam cut through the damp darkness, revealing concrete-reinforced wall. 50 feet in, the tunnel ended abruptly at a heavy, marine-grade steel door. It looked like the bulkhead of a submarine. In the center of the door was a heavy mechanical lock. Leonard reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key he had found in the jacket. He slid it into the mechanism. It fit perfectly. With a heavy metallic groan that echoed through the tunnel, the dead bolts retracted. Leonard threw his shoulder against the steel and pushed the door open. He stepped inside, expecting to find forgotten antiques, safety deposit boxes, or perhaps the remnants of a smuggler's den. Instead, he found a server room. The air inside was dry and climate-controlled, powered by an unseen, silent generator. Rows of sleek black filing cabinets lined the walls, and a large mahogany desk sat in the center of the room. It was a perfect replica of his father's study in Surrey, right down to the crystal decanter of scotch on the side table. Leonard approached the desk. Sitting squarely in the center of the leather blotter was a thick, leather-bound ledger. But it was the document resting on top of the ledger that made Leonard's blood run cold. It was a life insurance policy. The name on the policy was Amelia Pole. The payout date was 28 years ago. The amount was staggering £50 million. But that wasn't the twist. The twist was the listed beneficiary. It wasn't Thomas Pole. It was an offshore holding company named Blackwater Holdings, LLC. Leonard frantically flipped through the ledger. It wasn't just an accounting of his father's personal wealth. It was a map of corporate espionage and systematic fraud spanning 3 decades. The entries detail a complex web of shell companies, phantom cargo ships, and illicit wire transfers. As Leonard traced the columns of numbers, the horrifying truth began to snap into focus. His father's entire empire, Pole Shipping, was a massive hollow shell game. For the last 10 years, Thomas had been intentionally driving the company into astronomical hidden debt, using the main corporate entity as collateral to siphon billions into Blackwater Holdings, effectively laundering the money into untouchable Swiss and Cayman accounts. Leonard let out a sharp, breathless laugh. Beatrice and Richard hadn't inherited an empire. They had inherited a financial time bomb. When the creditors finally looked closely at the books of Pole Shipping, they would find nothing but empty vaults and insurmountable debt. Richard would be personally liable. Beatrice would lose the Surrey estate, the London properties, everything. They had been handed a poisoned chalice. And Leonard, by being formally disowned and severed from the company, Leonard had been legally insulated from the impending collapse. The punishment was actually a shield, but the money, the billions his father had siphoned away, where was it? Leonard turned his attention to the Swiss deposit slip he had found in the jacket. He booted up the desktop computer sitting on the mahogany desk. To his surprise, it wasn't password protected. It opened directly to a secure intranet portal. He typed in the 9-digit alphanumeric code from the Rothschild deposit slip. The screen refreshed. A bank statement loaded. Account balance, £1.4 billion. So authorized signatory, Leonard Thomas Pole. Leonard fell back into the leather chair, staring at the screen. 1.4 billion. The money wasn't just hidden. It had been legally and irrevocably transferred into a blind trust in Leonard's name. His father hadn't disowned him. He had saved him from the wreckage of the family he despised, leaving him the true fortune. But the relief and vindication were violently cut short. On the desk, beneath the life insurance policy, Leonard noticed a secondary file. The tab read, Operation Albatross, Amelia. With trembling hands, Leonard opened it. Inside were not financial documents but private investigator reports, police transcripts, and photographs. The first photograph was a black and white shot of a wrecked sailboat, the boat his mother had died on. But the forensic report attached to it highlighted a terrifying detail that had been omitted from the official police record. The rudder hadn't broken in the storm. It had been intentionally sawed halfway through before the boat ever left the dock. His mother hadn't died in an accident. She was murdered, and according to the timeline of the investigation notes, his father had known. Thomas Pole had spent the last 28 years hunting the person responsible. The final page of the file was a handwritten note from Thomas, dated just days before his death. I found him, Leonard, but he knows I know. If you are reading this, he got to me before I could finish it. The money is yours. Use it to destroy him. Look at the signature on the insurance payout. Leonard scrambled back to the life insurance policy, his eyes scanning the fine print at the bottom of the page, looking for the authorized signature representing Blackwater Holdings, LLC, the company that had profited from his mother's murder. There, scrawled in faded blue ink, was a signature Leonard recognized instantly. He'd just seen it yesterday on the inheritance documents. William Abernathy, The family lawyer, Abernathy, had orchestrated the murder, taken the payout, and likely poisoned Thomas Paul when the old man finally connected the dots. Abernathy was the one who had happily read the fake will, thinking he had won. Suddenly a loud metallic clang echoed through the underground room. Leonard froze. It was the sound of the heavy steel door at the entrance of the tunnel slamming shut. The mechanical lock clicked heavily into place from the outside. Leonard dropped the file and sprinted toward the entrance, throwing his weight against the cold steel. It didn't budge. He was locked in. Over the low hum of the servers, a crackling sound emerged. An old intercom speaker mounted in the corner of the ceiling sparked to life. "I always told your father you were too clever for your own good, Leonard." A dry, aristocratic voice echoed through the concrete bunker. The voice of William Abernathy. "Did you really think I wouldn't track the GPS locator I sewed into that wretched jacket?" Leonard backed away from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs as the sound of the rising tide began to echo ominously from the tunnel outside. "I always told your father you were too clever for your own good, Leonard." A dry, aristocratic voice echoed through the concrete bunker. The voice of William Abernathy. "Did you really think I wouldn't track the GPS locator I sewed into that wretched jacket?" Nuts. Leonard backed away from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs as the sound of the rising tide began to echo ominously from the tunnel outside. Through the heavy steel of the bulkhead, the dull, rhythmic thud of waves crashing against the exterior rock face vibrated into the floorboards. "Abernathy!" Leonard shouted, his voice cracking. "You killed her. You killed my mother." "Your mother was an unfortunate necessity, Leonard," the lawyer's voice crackled, devoid of any human empathy. "She had stumbled onto my little offshore arrangement. She threatened to expose me to Thomas. I couldn't have that. It was a simple solution to a complex problem. Just as Thomas's heart attack was a simple solution when he finally found that damning life insurance policy. Na, do and that park, ein beints, I the were verein. Swert, you poisoned him, Leonard said, the realization settling over him like a suffocating blanket. Digitalis, my boy, untraceable if administered correctly. A tragedy, the coroner said. The stress of the shipping business finally caught up with him. Abernathy chuckled, a dry, papery sound. And now, another tragedy. The disgraced, disinherited son, driven mad by grief, throws himself into the sea at Dead Man's Point. A fitting end to the Paul line. Goodbye, Leonard. Give my regards to your parents. The intercom went dead with a sharp hiss of static. Leonard threw himself at the heavy steel door again, twisting the mechanical lock with all his might. It was useless. Abernathy had engaged an external deadbolt. A sudden violent spray of freezing salt water shot through the microscopic gap in the door's rubber seal. The tide was coming in fast, and the pressure was building. In less than an hour, the tunnel outside would be completely submerged, and this room would become a watery tomb. Panic flared in his chest, but he forced it down. His father was a paranoid, calculating man. Thomas Paul would never design a secure vault without a contingency plan. A man who spent 30 years building an untouchable empire and preparing for war against his own lawyer wouldn't build a dead-end cage. Leonard sprinted back to the mahogany desk. He grabbed the waterproof vacuum bag, shoving the thick leather ledger, the life insurance policy, the Rothschild deposit slip, and his father's final notes inside. He sealed it tightly and slung it across his chest, zipping the Barber jacket over it to keep it secure. He frantically scanned the room. The server racks were humming, kept cool by an industrial air conditioning unit. Air. An underground sealed bunker running high-voltage servers needed an air intake and exhaust system to prevent overheating and suffocation. Leonard followed the thick insulated ductwork running along the ceiling. It led to a heavy iron grate bolted high on the back wall, perfectly camouflaged in the shadows. He dragged the heavy leather desk chair over, hopped onto the desk and scrambled up onto the top of the nearest server rack. Another violent shudder shook the room. The steel door bowed slightly, groaning under the immense weight of the Celtic Sea, and a steady stream of water began to pour onto the floor, quickly rising to Leonard's ankles. He reached the iron grate. It was held in place by 4 rusted industrial hex bolts. He patted his pockets, cursing loudly. He had no tools. But then his eyes fell on the heavy brass safety deposit key his father had left him. It was thick, rigid, and perfectly squared off at the base. Leonard jammed the base of the brass key into the first hex bolt and twisted with all his strength. Metal ground against metal. The skin on his palm tore, but the bolt gave way with a sharp crack. He moved to the second, then the third, adrenaline numbing the pain in his bleeding hand. By the time he reached the 4th bolt, the water in the room had risen to the 2nd tier of the server racks. Wires began to short-circuit, plunging the room into a strobing, terrifying darkness, lit only by the blue sparks of dying electronics. With a final desperate heave, Leonard ripped the iron grate from the wall and threw it into the rising water. The vent was narrow, barely 2 feet wide, but he didn't hesitate. He hoisted himself into the claustrophobic metal shaft, the cold steel biting into his shoulders. He crawled blindly upward, the sound of the ocean roaring behind him. The shaft angled sharply toward the surface. His lungs burned, the air growing thin and stale. Below him he heard the sickening crunch at the bunker door finally giving way, followed by the catastrophic rush of thousands of gallons of seawater violently flooding the room. The water surged up the vent, grabbing at his boots. Leonard clawed frantically at the smooth metal, pulling himself higher and higher until his head hit a solid surface. It was a wooden hatch. He shoved upward with both hands, kicking wildly. The wood splintered. Cold, fresh night air hit his face. Leonard hauled himself out of the vent, collapsing onto the damp, grassy cliffside of Dead Man's Point. He lay there in the pouring rain, coughing up seawater, his chest heaving. He was soaked, bleeding, and utterly exhausted, but as he felt the heavy, waterproof bag pressing against his ribs beneath the Barber jacket, a slow, cold smile spread across his bruised face. Abernathy thought he had won. Abernathy thought he had buried the truth at the bottom of the sea. But Leonard had survived. He had the ledger. He had the proof, and he had £1.4 billion. It was time to buy a new suit. 2 weeks later, the morning sun shone brightly over the pristine glass facade of the Harrison and Sterling law offices in Mayfair. Inside the sprawling top-floor conference room, the mood was decidedly less radiant. Beatrice Paul sat slumped in her chair, the color entirely drained from her perfectly contoured face. Beside her, Richard looked as though he might be physically ill, his head buried in his hands. Standing at the head of the table, William Abernathy adjusted his silk tie, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. Beside him stood Charles Sterling, the firm's senior managing partner. "I don't understand," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you mean, bankrupt? Thomas was worth billions. The ships, the contracts, the London properties. I assure you, Beatrice, this is as much a shock to the firm as it is to you," Abernathy lied smoothly, sliding a thick stack of forensic accounting documents across the table. "It appears Thomas was heavily leveraging the company for years. Paul Shipping is a hollow shell. The debts exceed the assets by over £400 million, and since Richard was named the sole inheritor of the executive board seat and the company's primary assets, I'm personally liable," Richard choked out, staring at the documents in horror. "They're going to take everything. The cars, the houses, my trust fund. I'm ruined. We will do everything in our power to shield your personal assets through bankruptcy court," Abernathy said soothingly, though a glimmer of dark satisfaction danced in his eyes. He had executed it flawlessly. The Pauls were destroyed, and his offshore accounts were flush with stolen wealth. "I'm afraid you won't be representing them in bankruptcy court, William." The heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open. Abernathy froze. Beatrice and Richard snapped their heads around. Leonard Paul walked into the room. He wasn't wearing the battered barber jacket. He was dressed in a razor-sharp, bespoke charcoal Savile Row suit, a platinum Patek Philippe watch gleaming on his wrist. He looked every inch the billionaire titan his father had once been. Leonard. Beatrice gasped, looking as though she had seen a ghost. Abernathy's jaw tightened, a microscopic crack in his composed facade. Leonard, you shouldn't be here. This is a private legal proceeding. It's not private anymore, William, Leonard said smoothly, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table. He snapped his fingers. Two men in dark suits stepped into the room. They weren't security guards. They were detectives from Scotland Yard's Financial Crimes Unit, led by Inspector Gregory Hayes. What is the meaning of this? Charles Sterling demanded, standing up. Who let you in here? I did, Leonard replied calmly. As of 9 o'clock this morning, my newly formed holding company acquired the lease to this building, as well as the majority of Harrison and Sterling's outstanding corporate debt. I own the ground you're standing on, Charles? Richard stared at his half-brother in disbelief. How? You were disowned. You had nothing. Father didn't disown me, Richard. He insulated me, Leonard said, his eyes locking onto Abernathy. He knew the company was a sinking ship, because he was the one sinking it. He spent a decade funneling his true wealth into a blind trust in Geneva, the trust he left entirely to me. Abernathy's face went completely white. The smugness vanished, replaced by stark, naked terror. That's impossible, he whispered. He whispered. £1.4 billion, William, Leonard stated, his voice ringing with cold authority. He reached into his leather briefcase and tossed a heavy, vacuum-sealed bag onto the mahogany table. He unzipped it and pulled out the thick leather ledger. I have spent the last 2 weeks with a team of forensic accountants and Inspector Hayes here, Leonard continued. We traced every single wire transfer, every phantom ship, every penny funneled into Blackwater Holdings LLC, and we traced Blackwater Holdings directly to you, William. This is absurd. These documents are forged. Abernathy sputtered, backing away from the table. Charles, call security. Have this man removed. Not my commands. Powder it not so. I wouldn't do that, William. Inspector Hayes stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. We've already executed a warrant on your private residence and your offshore accounts. The Swiss authorities have frozen everything. Leonard pulled out the final documents, the 28-year-old life insurance policy. The fraud was one thing, William. But murder, that's where you got sloppy, Leonard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register. You sawed through the rudder of my mother's boat. You signed the payout for her death. And when my father finally found the proof, you poisoned him. You thought you could trap me in that bunker to drown with the evidence. But you forgot one thing. Abernathy was trembling now, cornered. What? Oh, my father left me his jacket, Leonard smiled coldly. And a Paul always weathers the storm. Inspector Hayes grabbed Abernathy by the arms, spinning him around and snapping the handcuffs over his wrists. As the lawyer's Miranda rights were read aloud, Abernathy looked back at Leonard, his eyes filled with a helpless, venomous rage. He was dragged out of the conference room, his legacy destroyed in a matter of minutes. Leonard stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked down at Beatrice and Richard, who were staring at him with a mixture of awe and desperate pleading. Leonard, please, Beatrice whimpered, tears streaking her makeup. We're family. You have over £1 billion. You can pay off the company's debt. You can save the estate. Leonard paused, looking at the woman who had made his childhood a living hell and the brother who had never lifted a finger to earn a dime. Father left you exactly what you deserved, Beatrice, Leonard said quietly. An illusion. And he left you his debt, Richard, so you could finally learn what it means to work. He picked up his briefcase, turning his back on them. Where are you going? Richard cried out. To buy a new boat, Leonard replied without looking back. I hear Cornwall is beautiful this time of year. Leonard walked out of the glass doors and onto the bustling streets of Mayfair. The rain had finally stopped and the sun was breaking through the clouds. He had lost a company, but he had found his father's true legacy, and a billion reasons to never look back. Did Leonard's revenge leave you speechless? Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money, but the truth. If you loved this thrilling tale of betrayal, hidden wealth, and ultimate justice, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more incredible, real-life, inspired dramas. What would you do with $1 billion? Tell us in the comments.